Hello everyone, this is lecture 19 and 20, your last lecture of this quarter. So this lecture is going to be a bit shorter than, or really the length of a normal lecture, so you kind of get a 2-for-1. So hopefully that'll give you all a little bit of extra time to study for the final. So in today's lecture, we're going to be talking about contemporary experimental electronic music. And this is just kind of like a loose selection of artists that I sort of picked that I thought were interesting. And the reason why I picked a lot of these artists is because they live locally in the Bay Area or California. And there's a chance that you could, see them perform or something like that. And also I think it's like, it shows, it's not exactly representative of contemporary experimental electronic music, but it does show kind of a conglomeration and a continuation of a lot of the themes that we've been talking about throughout the quarter. So some of those themes, again, include that a lot of these artists either live in California or the Bay Area, with just, I think, one exception. They're all composer-performers. So like a lot of the artists that we've talked about this quarter, they not only write pieces, these artists also perform their own music. And, that doesn't mean that they don't sometimes write pieces for other people as well, but one of their primary vehicles for their work is to perform it themselves. Something that we also, I think, have been heading towards throughout the quarter is this kind of like conglomeration. That's not exactly the word I'm trying to use, but you know what I mean, like a sort of amalgamation of different genres or different media, different ways of making music. So what you'll notice, especially when I talk in part 2 of this lecture, a lot of the artists are incorporating lots of different styles and traditions of music making into what they're doing. They're also incorporating different media, so it's not just audio, it's also often visuals, and it's interdisciplinary. So really we start to see people they don't feel so siloed to stay in one kind of genre or one style. It's often combining multiple styles and multiple traditions. Another theme that we'll see, especially in section 1, is the use of gestural controllers. And gestural controllers are basically a device that you kind of put on your body so that your bodily gestures control the sound. And that's something that, again, we'll see in the first 2 artists. Improvisation is another theme that we will see, and this is the case in a lot of these artists. There is an improvisatory quality to a lot of their work, and that comes from themes like from the Sonic Arts Union and artists like Pauline Oliveros, but also free improvisation and things like the AACM and work by Black artists like George Lewis. So coming from kind of multiple improvisatory traditions there. And also the use of noise. So we'll see that there's this idea of something called noise music, and that's just kind of like music made up of literally noise. And so a lot of artists include or are inspired by noise music. And then lastly, a lot of the artists that we're going to talk about, especially in part 2, sort of consider their musical compositional performance practice as also kind of a spiritual practice. And again, this comes from kind of more Western artists like Pauline Oliveros, but also from the incorporation of non-Western musical spiritual practices into their work. So these are some of the themes that we will talk about today. First up, we're going to talk about an artist named Laetitia Sinami. And Laetitia Sinami was born in France. She originally studied to be a visual artist, and she made sculptures. But sort of throughout her time as an art student, she became more and more interested in sound and more interested in electronics. And one of the pieces that kind of sparked this interest and really solidified this interest for her was a piece. It was an installation that involved a light bulb that was triggered off and on, and she just became fascinated with the sound that this light bulb made as it turned off and on. And so if you can sort of continue in that theme of just like the ways in which the things that you see and the things that you hear are sort of connected, and also just kind of like the raw sound of electricity really fascinated her. So she then studied with Eliane Radigue in Paris, and remember we learned about Eliane Radigue when we learned about the synthesizer, and she made those kind of complex long drones. And there is definitely a sonic stylistic similarity in Laetitia Sinami's music. The way that she listens to sound and is just really in tune with the harmonic relationships of the sounds that are going on, even if she doesn't have a traditional musical background like Eliane Radigue did, but she does have kind of like a built-up, learned ability to listen that is now kind of like an intuitive listening practice. And I've had the privilege to know Letitia for a number of years and to be involved in some of her performances. And she spends, an hour or more before each performance, listening to the space, listening to the sound in the space, tuning her instruments and her performance to really kind of like finely hone the sounds that she's trying to achieve. So she has like a really incredible ear. So that was a bit of a tangent. But then after Letitia Tsunami studied in Paris with Eliane Radigue, she then came to the United States to study at Mills College in Oakland. And we did talk about Mills College before. It has kind of this long tradition of experimental electronic music making. So artists like Pauline Oliveros, Robert Ashley, and then some of the artists that we'll talk about today are also connected to Mills College. And she's been in Oakland ever since, so really since the early 1990s. And she's really enmeshed in the Bay Area electronic music scene. And she's become now kind of an important mentor to a lot of younger artists that are active kind of throughout the world now. So her early works incorporated a lot of handmade electronics, so again, kind of in the spirit of the Sonic Arts Union, things like that. But also her works involve narrative, and she doesn't always write her own narratives, but she's interested in narrative and using her voice to tell a story, and using the electronics to either kind of support that narrative or subvert it. And then also gestures, so she's interested in novel controllers. So we're going to talk today, our main focus is going to be on this novel gestural controller or novel instrument that she created called the Lady's Glove. And you can see here in this picture, she has, she's wearing the Lady's Glove. And the Lady's Glove is a glove that she designed and made herself. And in the first version, hacked a Mattel Power Glove. So some of us are old enough to remember that the Mattel Power Glove was kind of like an early version. It was an early video game controller, and you could control a video game using this glove. And she hacked this glove, she hacked the sensors, and applied them onto, the first version used a rubber kitchen glove. So you can imagine like a yellow rubber glove that you would use to clean the house or clean the kitchen. And she did this on purpose as kind of a joke, that she was like, the rubber kitchen glove is like the perfect housewife's tool. And the Lady's Glove is really explicitly a critique of gender roles and gender norms, and also sort of the macho control of technology. And here I have a video, a YouTube video that was the commercial for the Mattel Power Glove from the 90s. And you can see it's just this young kid, this young male presenting kid who's like, I have the power. And it's so aggressive. It's really macho, really masculine. And Letitia Tsunami was just like, what a joke. And really wanted to critique the sort of like traditional masculine approach to controlling technology. And that, again, is sort of the impetus for this piece. So she hacked the sensors out of this glove and applied them to a rubber kitchen glove for the first version. And then in later versions, you can see her here she kind of wears a longer mesh glove, which still kind of, the critique of gender still stands, because then it just kind of looks like an evening glove. So again, sort of critiquing and calling out sort of traditional gender norms. And you can see here it also very much presents like a cyborg. So those of us here at UC Santa Cruz might be familiar with Donna Haraway's work. And the cyborg is really a figure in which women and gender nonconforming individuals and queer people and people of color can really envision new futures for themselves using science fiction, using technology, and its way to kind of extend one's body into the future in imaginative ways to, again, kind of reimagine what a society or what a norm or what a gender or what a human could look like or be. And Letitia Tsunami's work definitely does that. So this glove has these sensors, and they're connected to a music programming language called Max MSP. And Max MSP is a graphical musical programming language that was developed in the 1990s, and it really came directly out of the Music N family of programming languages. It was influenced by an earlier graphical programming language called pure data, which was designed or created by a man named Miller Puckett. And so the name Max MSP refers to Max Matthews and Miller S. Puckett. So that's it. The name itself also kind of points to that lineage. And the language itself is graphical. So you can see here you sort of create basically it models the U-gens from the music and language, and you can basically create digital models of analog circuits that are used to synthesize sound. And so what this glove does, it has a number of sensors that then send out triggers and control parameters to Max MSP. And the trigger or the sensors include pressure, so the pressure between the pointer finger and the thumb, the distance between the two hands, between the hand and the ground, and the hand and a belt, the finger and hand position, and also the acceleration, so how quickly the hand moves. And again, these send signals to Max MSP, which do things including trigger samples, control or send parameters for synthesizing sound in real time, for vocal processing, and also it triggers lights and sometimes videos. So all of these things come together to create a real embodied performance. And Sanami considers the lady's glove an instrument. So she approaches it in the same way that many people would approach an instrument. She spends a lot of time practicing, using it. She fine-tunes her control using the instrument, and she definitely approaches it that way. So I've linked to several videos that you can just kind of watch at your leisure, and including this piece, Why Dreams Like a Loose Engine. Here is the performance here, and this is just a really incredible performance. And I would be more interested in, or this I think gives a great example visually and sonically of kind of the whole multifacetedness of her performances. So please watch this video. However, our required listening for this piece is a different piece called What Happened. And the reason why this is our listening piece is, one, because it's an earlier piece, and two, it's one of the few pieces that we actually have recordings of. For a number of reasons, Letitia does not like recordings of her pieces, partly because she's constantly changing them, and she doesn't like the fact that a recording sort of fixes the piece. For her, the piece is kind of recreated every time she performs it, and she does little things different every time, and is, again, constantly kind of changing what she does. So she really doesn't like recordings. So this piece, What Happened, is set to a poem by a Bay Area poet named Melody Sumner Carnahan. And this poem is kind of from the perspective of a woman, but she's very detached, almost like an anthropologist. And Letitia Sanami very much was attracted to that quality of this poem. And in the poem, she kind of tells the story about, a series of events in her life that are sometimes very violent and sometimes very graphic. And again, it's sort of from this distance, like she almost doesn't, it's like almost like someone else is describing this piece, like an anthropologist, not the woman herself, even though it's from a first-person perspective. And so this piece was originally created for radio broadcast, and Sanami loved the idea that there was this incredibly personal story that dissipates over the airwaves. And so what you'll notice, I think most strikingly, is that throughout the work, the narrator's, her voice sort of starts to kind of cut in and out. She does different vocal processing so that it's sort of her voice signal is interrupted. So this piece was originally created for analog circuits. It was not originally created for the Lady's Glove, but she then later adapted it for the Lady's Glove. So that's partly why we see this really long date range. It was originally created in 1980 with these analog circuits, but then adapted in the early 1990s for the Lady's Glove for performance. So other sonic qualities besides her voice, which you'll hear very clearly throughout the first, half of the piece or so, and then it'll really start to dissipate in certain places, and then it'll come back and you'll hear it more clearly again. Again, sort of this idea of like the dissipation of sound, this personal story kind of dissolving or disintegrating over the airwaves. And other sonic qualities of the piece include it's very sparse. You'll hear different samples, including the sample of a cassette rewinding, lots of washes of sound, kind of drones, repetitive drones. Again, that's kind of where the link to Eliane Radigue comes in. So that's your required listening. There's a link to the YouTube video here, but I'll also include a link after the lecture and on the listening section. Okay, so up next is another Bay Area artist named Pamela Z. And Pamela Z is also a composer and performer, but she has a much different background than Letitia Tsunami. She's classically trained in bel canto style singing. And bel canto means beautiful voice or beautiful singing, is another word for operatic singing. So she was basically trained to be an opera singer. And then as she progressed throughout her studies, she became more and more interested in experimental music and also studied what we call extended vocal techniques. And extended vocal techniques are ways in which a very trained singer will use her voice in ways kind of like not intended in Western bel canto style singing to create lots of different kinds of vocal effects. So lots of like vocal undulations or different ways of using her voice and her mouth or their mouth, if it's just any singer, in various ways, you know, kind of beyond just kind of more traditional styles of singing. Again, she also, in addition to singing in opera, she was also a singer-songwriter and very much influenced by kind of minimalist styles, I'd say like Laurie Anderson in particular, people like that. And she was introduced to electronics when she heard someone use a digital delay and digital reverb. And she became fascinated by digital delay and by looping pedals, things like that, because it was a way for her as a singer-songwriter to accompany herself while she was performing. And she continues throughout her career to incorporate looping and things like that into her style. So lately, more recently, she's also incorporated gestural controllers into her work, and you can see a version of one of these gestural controllers here. And she uses a gestural controller called the body synth. And this is more of like a kind of off-the-shelf gestural controller, but it works differently than the lady's glove. So this gestural controller has different sensors on her muscles, and when her muscles contract, it sends a signal. And she also uses Max MSP, that graphical musical programming language, to synthesize sound and schedule her sounds live. So again, her performances are very much embodied. They include her voice and her bodily movements that are sort of choreographed. They often sometimes include video. So again, it's really like a multimedia experience. And her pieces also include, as you can imagine with looping, a lot of layering. So our required listening for this section is a piece called Breathing. And the reason why I want us to why this is our required listening is that she's using a sensor here that's kind of maybe more like a theremin. It measures the body's capacitance in relation to this little box. But the reason why I want us to use this piece for our required listening is that the sole sound source for the piece is her voice. So she just layers loops of her voice on top of each other and on top of each other, and you really hear the range of the different kinds of things that she can use her voice. And I just love the way in which she uses just these very minimal means, just her own voice, to create this really kind of dynamic piece. And so that is your required listening. But I did also include a link to another piece that includes more electronics and things besides just her voice. And I'll include other videos that include the body synth after the lecture. Okay, so that's it for part 1. Up next in part 2, we'll talk about some more contemporary experimental electronic musicians. Okay, so in part 1 of the lecture, we talked about Pamela Z and Letitia Tsunami. And in part 2 of the lecture, we're going to focus on 2 different things. First, we're going to focus on artists that kind of tend to be categorized as sort of noise musicians. And then we're also going to look at an abstract turntablist. So I'm just going to gloss over sort of really briefly the history of noise music. And it's very much the history of the class, which is why I think it's very much relevant to our class. We can go back to people like Rousseau and the Futurists who wanted to incorporate the noise of the city, people like Cage and Schaefer who really embraced noise as a musical material, and I would put Stockhausen in that category as well. Then we get things like minimalism and heavy metal and punk, and people like Lamont Young, who we talked about when we talked about the Velvet Underground, just using really, really loud sounds, and someone who's considered sort of like one of the first albums that's really considered noise music is an album by Lou Reed, the frontman of the Velvet Underground, called Metal Machine Music, in which he just made a bunch of field recordings of just that, of machinery, but he also used guitar and guitar feedback and other guitar noises, and basically made this just like very noisy record. And a lot of people point to that, a lot of noise musicians point to that as sort of their inspiration for their work as noise music. And then also here I've included a link to The Dream House, which is a piece by Lamont Young, in which he just plays a very precise frequency at extremely loud volumes for extended periods of time. And by extended periods of time, I mean on the level of order of years rather than, say, like hours. So these are all sort of precursors to noise music. Someone who's also kind of maybe considered sort of the first music or the noise music artist or one of the first well-known noise music artists is a guy named Meersbaugh, who was really influenced by Dada and experimental music, especially tape music and also the use of analog electronics. He also has kind of a connection to BDSM and fetish culture. If you think about noise music, it's really loud and it tends to be unpleasant, so there is kind of like an element of like pleasure in the pain. One of his most famous albums is called Pulse Demon, which like really, really uses white noise. And he sort of considers his music noise concrete. So again, that's like a direct nod to someone like Pierre Schaeffer and musique concrete. Here's an excerpt if you're interested. Another person who I think is kind of interesting in this conversation is Tashimaru Nakamura and no input mixing, and that's basically where you just use a traditional mixer as an instrument by just using the feedback within the signal within the mixer. And it creates some really interesting, again, feedback and sort of sonic effects. And none of these are things you're going to be tested on, but this is kind of some of the context of things that we'll talk about later. So the first sort of like noise musician that I want to talk about is an artist named Zachary James Watkins. And he's much more than a noise musician. He is also has sort of like traditional compositions. And he has a huge range of influences, and his music will really reflect that. His influences range from people in our class that we've talked about that make live electronics music like Cage and Pauline Oliveros, David Tudor and the Sonic Arts Union, those people. And with Pauline Oliveros, he was also very much influenced by her spiritual and meditation practice. I realized that I mentioned that briefly in the last section, and I talked about it in one of the student hours, but I didn't really talk about it too much in the lecture about Pauline Oliveros. But in her later career, a lot of her music revolved around what she called deep listening, which was this kind of sonic meditative practice that was all around sort of like meditation using sound and meditation through listening. Watkins has been very much influenced by Pauline Oliveros, and he studied with her sort of throughout his time in the Bay Area. He is a local sort of Bay Area artist. He lives in Oakland. That was a bit of a tangent. He's also very much influenced by free improvisation by artists like George Lewis and the AACM and Ornette Coleman, and that'll become more clear in a little bit, as well as noise music and punk. And then also more recently, a lot of his music has incorporated elements of Jamaican dub music. And dub music, again, it's called dub because it often kind of revolved around making kind of crude copies or dubs of tape music using cassettes, but it has like a real characteristic sonic stamp that Watkins has incorporated into his music lately. So Zachary Watkins is So getting back to this kind of idea of music and spirituality, one thing that I think is really interesting about his works that you'll really probably notice when you watch the required listening video is that he really sees performance as a spiritual practice. He likens it to meditation. And this is comes from these both all of these influences that I mentioned. So both from kind of like a more Western incorporation of Eastern spirituality in someone like Paulina Oliveros, sort of deep listening, a focused listening, attentive listening, but it also comes from kind of the use of sound in Afro-diasporic spiritual practices, and it also in the use of gospel in the Black sort of Christian tradition in the United States. So it comes from all of these different places and just kind of the role of sound in spirituality. Um, and yeah, that'll probably become a bit apparent when you watch the video. So he's also probably most known for being a part of the duo Black Spirituals. And in this duo, he plays guitar and he also plays electronics. A lot of the electronics are guitar pedals, but they're also sort of analog synthesizer modules that he kind of hacks and hooks up into sort of like a network of just like a whole tray of electronics. And then he also plays with Marshall Trammell, who plays drums and other percussion. And one thing that I think is really interesting about this duo is that they very much they very much modeled their music making on sort of like the AACM, where they sort of consider themselves individual soloists, but they play together in this collective group. And there's this quote they have where he describes that, where he says, "We are a duo invested in each other and the emergent information created when we play. Our individual histories are mutually honored when we play. What we feel and hear. I personally enjoy the concept of tuning my ear in real time. What are you listening for?" And so again, this is tuning in real time. It's this improvisation practice that's very much, again, kind of like part of, like almost meditative, of really focused listening. And again, sort of like this individual in the collective, honoring each other's individual expressions and individual character as a performer, and just sort of allowing each other to have these individual sonic characters in this collective fabric of a real-time performance. So our required listening is this improvisation set, and I realize now that it might not be available anymore, so hopefully it will be, and I will, if not, I will link to something else. But either way, I'll link to an improvisation and you'll get really a sense of this kind of style that they have. And I also wanted to include an image of one of their records of deconstruction, because it sort of points to one of their big inspirations as a duo, which is kind of their lineage as Black artists. And this image is taken from a quilt that sort of is a part of Black and Afro-diasporic quilting practices in the United States. And so again, that is really important. And this idea of quilting and sort of like weaving both their individual sonic characters together, it's a really nice sort of visual metaphor for the music that they make. So Watkins is also a more traditional composer. He was trained as a composer. He's been through traditional music school, so he doesn't just perform himself. And one of his most recent compositions is a piece called Peace Be Till, which was commissioned by the Kronos Quartet, which is a famous string quartet that's from the Bay Area, local Bay Area quartet. And that's a traditional string quartet, so it's 2 violins, 1 viola, and 1 cello. And this piece is a really beautiful piece that was inspired by the gospel singer and civil rights activist Mahalia Jackson, who at Martin Luther King Jr.'s March on Washington kind of provided the impetus for him to give the I Have a Dream speech. I think the history is that the I Have a Dream speech wasn't necessarily what he planned to say, and Mahalia Jackson was there in the audience, and as Martin Luther King Jr. was speaking, she yelled out, "Tell him about the dream, Martin, tell him about the dream," and that sort of sparked him to go into the famous I Have a Dream speech. And it was also influenced by the work and sort of the writings of Clarence Jones, who was one of Martin Luther King Jr.'s speechwriters and advisors. So this piece is very much inspired by the civil rights movement of the 1960s, but also I think, very much in light of the Black Lives Matter movement, sparked after Ferguson in 2015. So sort of bringing elements of the civil rights movement to the present to sort of reflect on how, things have maybe changed or maybe still similar. And throughout the piece, he incorporates not only the string quartet, there's also electronics, so some electronic sound, as well as samples of Jackson's voice and Clarence Jones' voice. And in this excerpt that I have here, you'll hear an excerpt in which Clarence Jones is reading Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail, which he helped to kind of smuggle out of prison. And one of the themes that I think is really interesting of this excerpt is the focus on time. How long some things taken, or how long some things been going on, or how long someone waits and how not waiting anymore. And I thought that was just very relevant to the current moment, and also a really interesting kind of meditation, the way in which Martin Luther King Jr.'s keep referring back to time, and the way in which that the strings are kind of repeating these kind of repetitive elements over and over again, and then also maybe changing them. I thought was a really interesting kind of metaphor for also music and music as a metaphor for time. It was kind of a really interesting dynamic. And that also reminds me that I forgot to mention when I was talking about his work with Black spirituals and Watkins' work as a guitarist, is that his guitar playing is often, it's definitely in some ways likens to a lot of sort of more Black traditional musics in the United States and outside the United States, in that kind of incorporates repetition and variation. And so a lot of the times he'll pick a musical motive, so a series of 5 to 6 pitches that he'll play over and over again, and they're held out for a long time in a way that's similar to a band called Earth, if any of you have ever heard of them. And he actually, Black Spirituals actually toured with Earth, and it's a way in which kind of like the harmonics really ring out and creates like a really beautiful kind of immersive sonic environment that again is kind of meditative and again relies on sort of repetition and variation. And so I think that in some ways the string quartet music, even though it's very different, also kind of incorporates those elements. So this piece is really beautiful, and please listen to the excerpt. I also included here a little clip of kind of explaining the I Have a Dream speech and the role that Mahalia Jackson played there, as well as this excerpt of Watkins' Peace Be Till. Okay, so, it started. Sorry about that. That was an accident. But that was, well, you probably can't hear it because of the way that the videos work, but please go back and listen to that. It is your required listening for one of your other required listenings for this section. Okay, so up next, we're going to talk about Michaela Tobin. And Michaela Tobin is a composer and a vocalist. Like Pamela Z, she's classically trained as an opera singer, but she also is very well versed in extended techniques. And she has performed in traditional opera, but she prefers to perform in experimental opera. And she also composes her own experimental operas. So she really very much is a composer and performer. And we're not going to talk about her experimental operas. We're going to talk about her work that she performs under the moniker White Boy Scream. So even the name points to something that's very important in her work, which she definitely considers sort of decolonial or de-imperial or anti-imperial. She's very much critiques sort of contemporary capitalist and colonialist elements of our contemporary culture, and also draws from her own heritage from the Philippines. And so she incorporates a lot of elements and narratives and symbols from Filipino culture and folklore and the diaspora. And in this project, it really incorporates both her classical vocal training as well as noise and the use of electronics and effects on her voice. And you'll really hear both elements are really clear. Another element of her work is also spiritualism, sort of like Zachary Watkins, where many of her pieces she sort of considers spiritual rituals, and she also often draws from sort of more traditional ritualistic elements for her works that she performs. And she's performed in her own right, but again, she also sort of famously toured with the band Clipping as one of their vocalists. So that is a bit of a trivial tidbit. So our listening for Michaela Tobin, White Boy Scream, is a piece called Bakunawa. And this is from her recent record that came out in May. And Bakunawa is a figure from Filipino folklore. It is a serpent or a sea dragon. And in this myth, the Bakunawa, this dragon serpent, is supposedly goes around and is trying to swallow all 7 moons. There was 7 moons in kind of ancient Filipino mythology. And the people try to stop the serpent from eating the 7th moon, or the last moon, which is our current moon that we have now. And so the way that they do this in the myth is by banging pots of pans and making a clamor to scare the Bakunawa away. And this piece by White Boy Scream sort of centers around this narrative poem that was translated and read by her mother. And so throughout the piece, you'll hear sort of her mother speaking in Filipino or Tagalog, and then Michaela will sort of also sing and speak elements of it in English. So you'll hear both. And throughout the poem, I think most of the poem is from the perspective of the Bakunawa, of the serpent itself, even though the serpent is ultimately what is demised. And I think Michaela really sees this serpent as sort of a representative of her Filipino heritage in the diaspora. So basically of like not wanting the serpent to be destroyed or feeling like elements of traditional cultures are destroyed through colonial oppression, basically. So other than samples of pots and pans in the piece, she also, there's a section of the performance in which she applies a contact microphone onto this traditional Filipino broom called the Walis Tambo. So sorry if I pronounced that wrong. And she holds it up to her mouth and she scrapes it around. And so in the video, you'll see when she's using this, it's incredibly evocative and it's really loud. And what I love about Michaela's work is that even though there's times when it's really aggressive and really noisy, it's also often very controlled and very beautiful, and kind of it holds contrasting elements of sort of beauty and kind of harshness together, along with kind of Western and non-Western elements of contemporary and traditional elements all at the same time. And so I really love how her work is kind of able to hold all these elements together at once. So your required listening is Bakunawa, and I included a link here to a Vimeo of her performing the piece here in Santa Cruz last year. And then I'll also, of course, put a link after the lecture. So the last artist that we're going to talk about today is an artist named Maria Chavez, who is an abstract turntablist. And Chavez was born in Lima, Peru, so she is an indigenous Peruvian, and she now lives in the United States. And an abstract turntablist, so turntablists already sort of use turntables in ways in which they weren't intended, right? So turntables were originally meant to just play a record. And the turntablists, for instance, the ones that we talked about back in the hip hop lecture, they use the records to scratch, and they would flip back and forth the records. They were using the records in ways in which they weren't necessarily intended to be used. They expanded the ways in which turntables should be used. And of course now there's specialized turntables that are produced for DJs. But Chavez takes the sort of takes records and the turntable even further. And her practice sort of is very much inspired by both kind of like the hip-hop DJ, but also by a lot of the music that we've talked about in the class, for instance, musique concrète and the work of Pierre Schaeffer and his use of snippets of pre-recorded sound, but also the chance and indeterminacy of artists like Cage and Pauline Oliveros. She studied with Pauline Oliveros, and so Pauline Oliveros' practice of really close listening and improvisation through close listening were really influential to Chavez. So Chavez's practice really centers around using broken and scratched records that are sort of records that are kind of otherwise considered undesirable or would be considered undesirable in a different context, to make real-time sonic collages. So she makes these collages in the moment, in real time. She improvises, and she calls these collages vibration sculptures, and of course that just points to the fact that sounds are vibrations. And she's very much interested in kind of the chance elements of what's going to happen to these records at any given time. So her records, she stores them in a stack. Just they rub up next to each other, and every time she plays them, they have new scratches. And so she loves that element of like the unexpected, of what's she going to hear. It could be something great, it could be something awful, and she also incorporates broken records, so it ends up creating these really interesting kind of like rhythmic effects, because of course every time the record rotates you hear, the record bump on and off of a scratch or on top of one of another. It's really noisy, and she also really embraces what we might consider like glitch ethos, or an embrace of failure. She sort of takes failure as something to just accept and work through. So for instance, if she hears an unexpected scratch and it happens in a way in which the record stops or something, she just looks at that as something that, she incorporates into her performance and then builds upon, which I think is a really interesting sort of approach to the unexpected and approach to failure as just something, not something to be afraid of, not something to shy away from, but something to expect and really embrace and just kind of incorporate in whatever you're doing and work through. So I've included this really great video in which Chavez both talks about her practice and shows you examples kind of in real time. And so this is your required listening for this section. And that's it for lectures 19 and 20. I hope that you've all had a great time in this class and learned something. Feel free to reach out anytime. I'd love to stay in touch with you all. All right, take care.